Riane, first of all, you have been the most amazing and instrumental leader and think leader for the Be Women movement, Be Women Solutions movement. You know, we really are carrying the blade of the caring economy to make homage to your book, The Chalice and the Blade, and because we truly believe that the caring economy is an economic system that really needs now more than ever, because we need to really care, genuinely care for people, their wellness and fulfillment, as well as the respect and responsibility for the environment. So Riane, you are currently the president of the Center for Partnership Studies and the Caring Economy Campaign. I love that because you have been the most amazing pioneer for the last 40 years regarding human rights and for women and children. An incredible change maker. And your book, The Chalice and the Blade, has been translated in more than 26 languages. You're an incredible feminist leader that not only has brought through women's briefings to the UN, so the US Supreme Court, about how to include in the 14th Amendment issues about equity, equality, and protection. Your book that today we're going to be discussing, that I absolutely love, is The Real Wealth of Nations, Creating a Caring Economy. Our inspiration for Be Women Solution was hailed by nonetheless Nobel Peace Laureate Archbishop Desmond Tutu as a template for a better world we have been so urgently seeking. And it's, to me and to many, it's a must read, not only but for economists, but for in schools, because it is an amazing framework for the new economy that incorporates human well-being and optimal human development. And it's a keystone, not only for governments, but also for businesses, for NGOs, for anybody who is dealing with issues on economy or wants to move forward towards something that is better. So on this, thank you, Riane. And can we start right away talking about this amazing book you've written, even though it's been written in 2007, but there's so much updates you've done and so many things that I have done. So tell us what propelled you to write this book then, and what is still standing of the book today? The big question.
Well, I think that the book is today perhaps even more relevant than when I wrote it, because, well, of many reasons, but one of them is the COVID-19 pandemic, because what it has really revealed are the structural faults in present economic systems. And what it has shown, for example, is that who are the essential workers? They're the healthcare workers. They're the workers that take care of children, mostly women in homes. They're the people who care for having enough food. So what we are really seeing revealed is that we have been working with outdated and really inhuman and uncaring economic values guiding our economic systems. And that, I think, is something that the Real Wealth of Nations explains in detail, not only how we got here, but what we need to do to change. And some of that is already underway, but we need what we are launching now, which is a partnerism movement, a movement that can really unite us so that so many of us who are working for economic justice, for women's rights, for racial justice, for environmental sustainability can have really a unified conceptual framework and see that it's all about the shift from what I've called a domination system, which includes, of course, the domination economics, to a partnership system, which, of course, has an economic system that recognizes the economic value of the most essential human work, the work of caring for people starting in early childhood, whether it's in the market or out of the market, whether it's done by women or men, and caring for nature.
Yeah, that's, it just touches my heart so deeply what you say, because if you can go further and explain to us in your research about patriarchy, and how did the domination and partnership society system rose up, and why do you think this is still so entrenched in today's economic systems?
Well, if you look at the whole span of our cultural evolution, as I have, not only in the Real Wealth of Nations, but as you mentioned, starting with the Chalice and the Blade, and now ending with my latest book that came out last year with Oxford University Press, Nurturing Our Humanity, what we're really talking about is a nonlinear journey. We started more in a partnership direction. As my co-author of Nurturing Our Humanity, the anthropologist Douglas Fry, writes, the original partnership societies were the gathering hunting societies in which we lived for millennia. And they were not top down, they were not male dominated, they were not violent, and certainly not warlike. But then, as I document in my books, particularly in The Chalice and the Blade and in Sacred Pleasure, there was a shift during a period of great disequilibrium to the domination side of the partnership domination social scale. And what we have had for the last 5,000 or so years are intermittently periods where we've tried to move back towards our partnership roots, or rather to move forward to a partnership system. But it's only in the last 300 years that we've seen one social movement after another challenging one thing, a tradition of domination. And once we understand that, we can see that so many of us who are working on environmental sustainability or on social justice or racial justice or gender equality or the human rights of not only women but children and everyone, we're really part of the partnership movement, because all these movements have challenged the same thing, a tradition of domination, whether it was the so-called rights of man movement in the 18th century, challenging the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule their subjects, or the feminist movement, challenging the so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule over the children and women in the, quote, castles of their homes, whether it was the abolitionist, civil rights, anti-colonial movements challenging yet another so-called divinely ordained tradition of domination, the so-called divinely ordained right of a, quote, superior race to rule over inferior ones, all the way to the social and racial justice movements, to the economic justice movements, to the movements against violence, which is how domination systems ultimately maintain themselves, through fear of pain, of violence, all the way to the environmental movement challenging yet another tradition of domination, our so-called hallowed conquest of nature, which at our level of technological development could be the end of our species. So if we understand that, that we are part of this enormous movement and understand that we need to build the foundations to avoid domination regressions like the one we're in now as I speak, then we can really build a more just and caring, not only economy, but society.
Yeah, and you're saying it right. Build a foundation. You see, what I see is you say that there's a tradition of domination, but the tradition of domination and all these movements are always like skimming at the top. Is like they're taking people on the power of the top, and then others go on the top. So there's continuous, there's a continuous revolving of who's in the top. Is either the kings, the emperors, and you have it's always more and more people, but we still have the big corporations that are at the top deciding on our economy, on our environment, how they're going to deal with marketing, how they're going to convince us about buying the value of something is valuable or not valuable. So if you can give us what is in your experience, what are the best journeys we women and men can go through step by step of what should we do to make that change in building the foundations of a partnership society?
Well, as you know, I have identified 4 cornerstones. One is childhood, because we know from neuroscience, and this is discussed at great length in Nurturing Our Humanity, of course, we know that what children first experience or observe impacts nothing less than how our brains develop. And with this, how we think, how we feel, and how we act, how we vote, what values we have, what do we consider important. And that takes me to gender, because as is detailed in The Real Wealth of Nations, we have inherited in this 5,000-year period a gendered system of values. And what I mean by that has nothing to do with anything inherent in women or men. What I mean is that domination systems have very rigid gender stereotypes. Being a real man is not being like a woman, period. So what does that really reflect? It reflects this gendered system of values in which anything considered stereotypically feminine, like caring, caregiving, nonviolence, is not economically supported, among other things. But of course, it's more than the economy, it's our whole way of symbolizing what is and is not important, our educational system, which either ignores or marginalizes, if you think about it, the majority of humanity, women and children. I mean, humanities, where women and children barely figure. I mean, how we can call this humanities is really food for thought, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's kind of crazy. But economics is one of the cornerstones, but going beyond capitalism and socialism to what I call a caring economics of partnerism. And yes, stories and language. We, as linguistic psychologists have told us, the categories made available by a culture channel our thinking. So right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, they really make it impossible to see another alternative, because think about it, if we really want a more just society, a more environmentally balanced, caring society, there have been uncaring, environmentally destructive, oppressive, repressive, violent societies in every one of our conventional categories. So like a colleague of mine says, these are really weapons of mass distraction, aren't they? That fragment our consciousness. And we need to go deeper to the configuration of the partnership and domination system. And then we can see that we have inherited an uncaring economics, and that this uncaring economics was perpetuated in both capitalist and socialist theory, which relegated the most important human work, the work of caring for people starting in childhood, and of course the work of caring for our environment, our home environment, which translates into our natural environment, to women's work, to only reproductive rather than, quote, productive work. We've inherited this. It's still being taught in our economics schools, and we've got to change this.
Yeah, and you really rightly say. So basically the four paradigms are childhood, gender, economics, and storytelling.
And language, We need new language. This is why the partnership system and the domination system are so important, because our old categories keep us sort of really fighting each other and going around in circles.
Yeah, exactly. So, and so you rightly say that, you know, we have capitalism and socialism. They both have been ignoring or totally not valuing what is, or visibilizing what is caring, and caring for people and caring for nature. But also, can you tell us more about the GDP and all your studies in the last many years? You've been actually working on changing the paradigms of how do you measure GDP, because that's one of the biggest issues, cornerstones of economics, that everybody's just thinking of GDP growth, but I think we're going nowhere in this.
Well, because we're not measuring our real wealth, are we? We're just measuring something very artificial. In fact, if we really look at our newspapers today, in this age of COVID-19, the gap between where the stock markets are and between where people, human beings are, is ridiculous. I mean, it's like they live in an artificial universe. What we really are not measuring is our real wealth. GDP defines wealth. Well, first of all, GDP includes as, quote, productive activities that actually harm and take life, like making cigarettes, selling cigarettes, and the resulting medical bills, the resulting funeral bills. They're all great for GDP. Oil spins, wonderful for GDP. The cleanup costs, the lawsuits, but not only does GDP include negatives as positives, it fails to include as, quote, productive work, the work that is carried out in the three life-sustaining sectors of the economy: the household economy, the volunteer community economy, and the natural economy. And I would like to suggest that these three sectors are the sources of our real wealth. And as a matter of fact, you ask, what do we need to do? We've been working on a very different way of measuring economic health, a way that is really not only more humanly and environmentally appropriate, but also much more appropriate in our knowledge service post-industrial age. When, think about it, economists keep telling us that our most important capital in this new technological era is what they like to call high quality human capital. Well, whether we have these flexible, creative people who can really cope with change including rapid technological change, who can work together in teams, etc. This largely hinges on whether or not children very early on, starting really very early when our brains are having their major developmental spurts, whether they receive good care and education. And yet, because of our hidden system of gendered values, somehow, think about it, there's always money for, well, for prisons, right? The punitive male stereotype of the punitive father, right? Head of household. Or there's always money for weapons and wars. The hero, the violent hero. But somehow we don't have money for the soft, the stereotypically feminine, right? Child care, public health care. It's really crazy, isn't it? But so we have to unpack this. It isn't that we are bad. It is that we have inherited domination economics. And it's not capitalism or socialism. As I said, neither Smith nor Marx recognized as, quote, productive work, the so-called women's work of caring for people starting in childhood and keeping a clean and healthy environment, which of course translates into a natural environment. It is domination economics, whether it was Chinese emperors or Arab sheiks or feudal lords or kings. I mean, it doesn't matter. And trickle-down economics, if you really think about it, is just the latest form of domination economics, where those on bottom are supposed to, as in feudal times, content themselves with the scraps dropping from the opulent tables of those on top. So it keeps recycling itself, and we have to understand that to change this, we have to look at the foundations. And one of these foundations is what children first experience and observe, and gender. So that it's not coincidental that whether it was Hitler in Germany with his really top-down economics, or Stalin in the former Soviet Union with their top-down economics. I mean, yes, they did alleviate to some extent extreme poverty, but at what costs? I mean, destruction of the environment, a dictatorship, lack of freedom, millions killed. I mean, this is hardly where we want to go, is it? And that was a mass application of socialist theory. So what we're really talking about is changing our thinking in a more inclusive way that no longer ignores or marginalizes issues that progressives still think of as so-called just women's issues and just children's issues. We need an integrated conceptual frame that takes into account the whole of humanity, the whole of our history, and yes, the whole of our lives, including where we all live in our family and other intimate relations, which are formative.
I think, thank you, Riane. I think Eli here has unmiked and wanted to ask a question.
Okay, I was just typing it. Let me just finish. So I'm just curious. I've been reading with the current Black Lives Matter movement that if we address the state of Black women as part of that movement, it will actually address or kind of resolve the larger human rights issue for everybody. What do you think about that? Is there truth to that?
Well, there's some truth to that, but that's not the whole story. Yes, in the market, it is mostly Black and brown women in the United States that perform the direct care work for poverty wages, but it's all women who perform that work in the United States for no wages, for no social benefits, unlike, say, Northern European nations, which have caring policies, generous paid parental leave for both mothers and fathers, high investment in really early childcare that's accessible and high quality, elder care with dignity, higher wages for educators as well as direct care workers. Now, they're not ideal, but they have moved more to the partnership side. They have more democracy and equality in both the family and the state, right? They have much more gender equity. Women are 40 to 50% of the national legislature. And what happens then is that as the status of women rises, so does the value given to the stereotypically feminine, like caring and caregiving. So they were so poor at the beginning of the 20th century that there were famines. Today, these nations are regularly in the highest ranks of the World Economic Forum's global competitiveness reports. But why? One of the major reasons was that they have more caring policies. They invest heavily in their human infrastructure, starting in early childhood, and in their natural infrastructure, and they're not socialists. They have a very healthy market economy. And the reason for this is not that they're smaller and more homogeneous. There are plenty of small, homogeneous nations that orient to the domination side. Okay? So we're talking about moving to a different social configuration, which is invisible as long as we think right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western.
You know, I certainly appreciate your sensibility, and I know I'm coming at you from a United States perspective where it just feels like it's just shocking that at this age, at this time in human history, we have not wrestled down the gender disparity. However, in this country right now, it seems like we are not going to be able to do anything until we wrestle down the race issue. I am totally down with that because, slavery and the whole foundation of this country on a lie needs to get fixed. But it's almost like we can't do both at the same time. And so do we have to kind of, we just seem to be, as a society, incapable. I don't know. I mean, the fact that women who have been around since the beginning of time have not been able to achieve equality, despite numerous movements. I mean, as a young lesbian, I was reading the Chalice and the Blade as our manifesto. I gotta tell you, many moons ago, you were like one of the mothers of the revolution, and here we are today, and we are no further along.
We are further along. Let's really look at this realistically.
Yeah.
When I wrote The Chalice and the Blade in 1987, but when I first became involved in the women's movement was much earlier. Even the want ads were segregated. Help wanted male, help wanted female, was all the dead-end helper jobs under help wanted female. It wasn't a question of the glass ceiling, it was just even getting in.
Right.
Laws were completely discriminatory. Violence against women. I mean, I started the first center in the United States on women in the law. People would look at me and say, women in the law, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. It meant totally discriminatory laws and practices. The fact that we have a Me Too movement, And to say that we can't do both together, we have to do both together. And I'm going to tell you why. Because they're inextricably interconnected. What we're talking about is in-group versus out-group thinking, whether it's white versus black, or Shia versus Sunni, or Sunni versus Shia.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. And it's rooted in the model of our species. It's not coincidental that whether it was for Hitler, for Khomeini, for the people who voted for Trump, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Not all of them, but they believe in this so-called traditional family that is authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive. And these are the people who are also completely into denial about everything, including racism, climate change. We have to go to the roots of the problem. You cannot solve racism without also solving the gender disparity.
Yeah, hence my question about if we address Black women just as a class, does it basically address a much larger human rights issue? Because
It depends on how we frame it. If we only frame it in terms of race, no. If we frame it by showing that the underlying problem is not only that they're Black and brown, but that the work that is so fundamental to human well-being, to human survival, the work of care and caregiving, has been devalued because it's considered women's work. If we work on it by making people aware of this model of our species in which difference, beginning with the difference between the female and male form, is equated with either superiority or inferiority, dominating or being dominated, being served or serving, and that is then generalized, as we see all over, to other outgroups, be they based on race, like here, be they based on religion, as in anti-Semitism, or Shia versus Sunni, or Sunni versus Shia. It doesn't really matter. You always have to deal with root causes. And if you ignore those root causes, then you can solve, well, as you said, all you are creating is another domination class, another domination system. But so what? I mean, that's what happened in the former Soviet Union. That's what happened in China, because the underlying cultural system was domination-based.
And even, I do wonder if in your work, referring to gender as only a binary thing is problematic, because that's another, I'm not saying you are problematic, I'm saying the whole heteronormative model is just another form of domination.
Well, no, because I don't refer to it that way. If you notice, I acknowledge that there have always been people with a different sexuality.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying you do it, but I just think the conversation, if it's binary in terms of the gender roles.
Look, the truth of the matter is that we're talking about rigid gender stereotypes.
Right, right.
And we're not talking about anything inherent in women or men. And once we establish that, we can see that the movement towards greater gender fluidity, like the trans movement, or before that, the movement towards different gender sexual identities, that's all part of the movement towards partnership. What I don't think is useful is to call people who are heterosexual cis, which has become a pejorative, or to deny that women as a group worldwide, I mean, there are commonalities in domination-oriented systems that all women experience on a gradation. And one of them is really inferiority that we internalize. I mean, women themselves will support male dominance as that's just the way it is, or it has to be.
Totally. My understanding of cis, though, is that it really just is refers to when your gender of birth happens to match your gender identity. It's just.
But it's being used in
right?
as a pejorative against feminists. You know that.
Yeah, I've not heard that, but
Yeah,
I wouldn't be surprised.
Which is how domination systems maintain themselves. Let's have them at each other.
And I think that's a very good point. And Ponder would like to ask a question.
Ponder wants to talk.
I do. This is such an exciting topic. And well, I have a question, but I also want to just contribute something to this, if I may, which is that the question of whether or not the gender binary exists is used to delegitimize the exposure of these dynamics, right? So it's kind of like how sometimes postmodernism is equated with a moral relativism, as if acknowledging the genuine value of different subjectivities is the same as saying that they're all completely valid and have the same power. So it's not the same argument. And I think that people who are trying to dismiss the analysis of masculinity and femininity as regressively binary are not helping. I'm just going to put that out there. But the question that I wanted to ask is that, Riane, I've heard you say many times, especially I think maybe in the genesis of this book, there was a sense of the human rights argument being inadequate to persuade a room full of people who actually had power to make certain decisions.
Absolutely.
And that you had to then go into the weeds of proving everything quantitatively, which is not ultimately the heart of your work anyway, I don't think. And I was wondering if you could speak to whether or not you think that this COVID era offers us an opportunity to return to the human rights argument as fundamental.
Well, I think it does. On the other hand, I also think it offers us an opportunity to introduce different metrics, different measures of economic health and with it of wealth. And that's why I have been working on the first launching the social wealth economic indicators, but there are 24 of them. So, and now condensing them into an index, which would be one number, but it would be a number that reflects the fact that of the enormous return on investment in the work of caring for people starting in childhood and caring for nature. And we have to get these new metrics out there. I'm never an either or, but a both and person. And I think in complex living systems, you have so many variables that you really have to understand the interaction between so many elements. So yes, as you said, Panda, I believe that some people are stuck in the domination paradigm, and not only the economic paradigm, but usually with it, the gender paradigm, the racial paradigm, it's all manifestations of the domination system. And to reach these people, we also have to show the economic value of this so-called soft feminine work, women's work of caring for people in both the market and non-market sectors of the economy. Because remember, not only are capitalist and socialist theory totally outmoded, I mean, they came out of early industrial times in the 1700s and 1800s, and we're now in the 21st century post-industrial age, but they came out of more rigid domination times in which, I mean, even when Marx wrote, in most places, women were so completely, their work was so completely invisible that if a woman was injured, she could not sue for her injuries. Only her husband could for loss of her services. I mean, talk about slavery here. I mean, John Kenneth Galbraith called it crypto servants, is what women were. And I would take out the crypto. They were just servants, you know, glorified by, you know, some other title. But we've all inherited the thinking that, oh, that's just normal. And as Gandhi said, we must not confuse the habitual with what is natural. And that's where the alternatives of the partnership and domination system, and really offering a real alternative and how to build it, are so important. And that's why we're launching our partnerism campaign at the Center for Partnership Studies. And on the 20th of this month, we will have a partnerism summit. So stay tuned, go to centerforpartnership.org, and you can find out all about it and sign up for our mailing list, because then you will be included.
So that will be, can you repeat the date? Is that August?
I think it's on August, let me get my calendar, because I've got so many things I'm doing, my dear. And we are doing the summit on August the 20th from noon to 3 Pacific time.
Okay.
And
we will make sure
all
that
invited.
many will participate.
I think that Anne has not yet started to publicize it, but we've got some great things happening, including the development of the Social Wealth Index, which is a practical tool, you know, for moving from domination to partnership.
Thank you. You know, Donna has been very patiently waiting for a question. Donna, please, hopefully we can answer your question.
I don't have a question, it was just a comment, because I do think we have somewhat primitive biological forces. I mean, underneath everything. Now we have this ability to see abstractly, and we can go to this other dimension and know better. Like, we can stop the urges. But obviously in the animal kingdom, you know, males have plumage to attract females. They get in power fights to attract females. So there is a certain amount of that naturally in the animal world. I have a biology background. But we also can make beautiful art and do a lot of other things. So I feel like there's that force, that ability to be creative and see beyond the physical, you know, and biological, you know, natural urges. But all I'm saying is there is that, you know, so, you know, a lot of women, you know, I feel like I'm a woman, I'm a feminist, but, you know, I see a lot of my friends, you know, evaluating guys based on how, you know, how much they earn and, you know, that, you know, so everybody contributes to this hierarchical kind of thing. And they don't even know it. You know, I just think,
all these unconscious bias that exist.
They do, and it's not even they're meant meanly. It's just weirdly what happens, and then all of a sudden, you know.
But why?
I mean, like a lot of. I mean, it's getting way better, like you said before, to me. But I just wanted to say that there is this natural underlying throughout the animal world, you know, so it's not coming from nowhere.
Well, actually, I have to say that you can always find an animal to justify your beliefs about, quote, human nature.
Yes.
I prefer the bonobo chimpanzees to the common chimps. They're
Yeah.
not dominated. They have this, by the way, they're just as genetically related to us, just as closely related. The paternity is not, there's no violence in sexual relations, and they share and care more. They share sex and they share food. But I want to say something, and here's where the work of my partner, my husband, David Lloyd, comes in, and I highly recommend this to you. Read Darwin's Lost Theory, because what we're really talking about is the stories that have been magnified. And with Darwin, the story that's been magnified to make us think it's natural, right, is largely the story of the so-called lower animals, right? But when Darwin wrote about human evolution in The Descent of Man, he wrote that at the human level, the level of cultural evolution, different dynamics come into play. You referred to some of these. We are capable of abstract thinking. We create music in a way, I mean, it's a matter of degree, okay, but the degree is spectacular. I mean, Mozart, Gandhi, you know, I mean, so I think that we really have been sold a bill of goods, because there is just as much cooperation, for example, in the so-called animal kingdom as there is competition. But what has been emphasized, you know, survival, you know, the struggle for survival. So let's forget about other species. Let's look at ours. And this is why Nurturing Our Humanity is such an important book, because it takes into account findings from both biological and social science, especially neuroscience, showing that by the grace of evolution, the so-called pleasure centers in our brains light up more when we share and care than when we win. So we are actually wired by evolution. But what is not taken into account then is given half a chance. And domination systems don't give us that half a chance, do they? And one of the major reasons is that we start with dividing our species into the male in-group and the female out-group in domination systems, and all of this in-group versus out-group thinking. And we miss the reality of our situation, especially today at this level of technological development, that we have got to move from domination to partnership. And what's at stake is our survival. So we have to go deeper. And when you say that women look for the men who will take good care of them, well, why do you think that is? For the millennia of domination history, women had no access. Remember when I first started to do my work, the want ads, that was in the 60s and 70s. The want ads in the United States were segregated into help wanted male and help wanted female, with all the dead-end helper jobs relegated to women. We're not talking about the glass ceiling, we're talking about just getting in. So no wonder women have been teaching each other, you've got to find this guy who can really take care of you, right? Because we were prevented, number one, from gaining access to the, quote, well-remunerated jobs, but also basically because of this gender system of values, which in both socialist and capitalist theory gave no value as productive to the work of the so-called women's work, right? Whether it's performed by a woman or a man, whether it's done in the market or outside the market of caring for people starting in childhood and caring for our natural environment. So there are reasons for this that are very logical, but we don't see them unless we look at them, and then we accept that this is natural. And so I'm trying to say, no, as Gandhi said, let's not mistake what's habitual for what is natural, and let's not mistake what may work for a slug to what we're capable of as humans.
Thank you. I mean, that was really very, very profound, and especially with the issue about competition, because I think that one of the issues that we really bring about is that competition breeds betterment of a species, but also it brings people to the top and some to the bottom. And I think that's very human nature. But I think that you say, should we connect with the slugs or to the better of humanity? Or the, you know?
Well, absolutely, Laura. And I think that we have to define competition. Competition in the domination system is what we call dog-eat-dog competition. I mean, dogs don't eat dogs, but it's, I'm going to destroy you. Whereas in the partnership system, there is still some competition. If you excel, and I see you excelling, it spurs me on to also excel. It's a different kind of competition. I think that there is competition in both systems, and frankly, there's also cooperation in domination systems. Think about it, monopolies cooperate, the OPEC members cooperate, to gouge, to make oil and to pollute and I mean, gangs, criminal cartels, invading armies, they all cooperate. So the question is cooperation for what end? Is it for everyone? And that has to include women and children, which have been ignored from what we're taught as important knowledge and truths in domination system, or is it this other kind of thing? So everything has changed, even hierarchies, as I've said, hierarchies of domination or hierarchies of actualization, because we need parents, we need teachers, we need managers, we need leaders, but we have to have a different, more fluid hierarchy where really accountability, respect, benefit don't just flow from the bottom up as in domination system, they flow both ways. And power is not just power over, but power with, and that power that we have so much about, the power to create for our common benefit, power with and power to.
Beautifully said. Power with and power to. I think that's so beautiful. We have a few minutes left, and I would like to open up maybe to other questions, or if you want to make some closing remarks, Riane. I think this is such a important message you're giving to us all about how we reconstruct the new wealth of nations, the real wealth of nations in our society.
Well, if there are no questions, I will close by reminding us that economic systems, social systems are human creations. We created them. We created economic inventions. Yeah, slavery is a domination economic invention, isn't it? But we also have wonderful government policies that adequately and highly reward the work of caring for people, starting in childhood. We can do that. So what we need to really focus on is what values underlie our policies and our practices. And that is the real question. And that is the question of shifting from really an economics of domination to a caring economics of partnerism. And we can do it, and we are in bits and pieces doing it, but we need that coherent, unified framework. So as Ellie brought out, people can stop fighting each other when in fact they are striving for the same goals.
Exactly. The most interesting thing that you're saying is that values are created by society, by governments, and so to recalibrate what is valuable to us as a society. That's so important to bring forward, because if we don't bring forward our, and I think that companies are doing that now, especially like the Patagonias, Unilevers, the big companies. I think COVID has really brought this up, of changing values into how they treat their employees, what they do to the environment. And I think that there's a mass movement towards leaders in these big companies that actually are being more selfless. And so we are moving towards a core of this society. However, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think they're not only being more selfless, they are recognizing that their enlightened self-interest is to move from domination to partnership. That all around us, the old domination structures and values are proving what they are: false, unsound. So we're not just talking about deconstructing, protesting, and we don't like this, we don't like that, but reconstructing. And that's really where the four cornerstones come in. Because you wouldn't think of building a house without building solid foundations. And if you look at the cornerstones of childhood, gender, economics, and stories and language, you see that because the people pushing us back have managed to push the normative ideal for these towards the domination side, we've been moving backward. But that we can move forward if enough of us recognize that this is not about right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern. It's about, within these systems, shifting from domination to partnership. And that to ignore the majority of humanity, women and children, in our reconstruction as well as our deconstruction is absolutely insane. Especially in light of what we know from neuroscience about what children first experience and observe, parenting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gender, how that is constructed. I mean, we ignore the obvious, which is that it's not coincidental that people who grow up in families of rigid male dominance tend to also be racist, think in terms of in-group versus out-group, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's Shia versus Sunni, Sunni versus Shia, it doesn't really matter. There's some fundamentals here that we have to address.
And just to close, one of the things that really is really touching my heart is the question about unconscious bias.
Yes.
And because it seems like all your theory is very much based on this domination that is so unconscious that we keep pushing and creating and moving forward towards domination because of these unconscious bias. But what is your suggestion? What is your practical suggestions to start dismantling this unconscious bias we have about childhood, gender, economy, and language?
Well, there are many people who are working today on mindfulness. And I would like to suggest to those people who are working on mindfulness that they incorporate into the materials that they offer in their mindfulness, not only the practice of, say, meditation, but waking up from the domination trance and beginning to take into account all of humanity, including the majority, women and children, taking into account what we know from no less than so-called hard science about like neuroscience, about how childhood and gender are so vital in terms of how they are constructed and how we think, feel, and act. So I would suggest that if we incorporate in consciousness the concept of waking from the domination trance and show people that there are issues we have to address if we're going to not just change our own consciousness, but the social structures and the values around us. That, I think, could make a huge difference.
Okay, so we do have a few sessions on meditations, and we'll definitely make sure they listen to this video and incorporate all these issues about values in their meditation. Yes, you're right. And one of the things we try to tell our community is that how important is that no matter where we are, we always receive gifts of no matter the difficulties we're having, look at the gifts that you're receiving and see the positive sides of how to put everything on a positive side, of what's happening.
Well, I think it's absolutely insane to talk about consciousness of oneness like some of the Indian seers do without recognizing the reality of India, which is that women and children are so completely devalued that they don't even exist in their minds as counting. I mean, if you don't start with that basic stuff, then you can talk about oneness until you, it's meaningless is what I'm trying to say. Let's add reality to this.